Is the Pope the Pope? Yes, unfortunately. I'm Simon Rafe, and I'm taking the Hardline. Welcome back to Hardline, the show where I make you feel bad about yourself so you can be better. I'm your host, Simon Rafe, and my producer is Joe Enders at the desk with the levers and buttons. He and I will be chatting later on, and later on, I'll be talking with Dr. Jules Gomesh, our Rome correspondent, about what is going on in Rome and in other places. But for now, the Pope. Is he the Pope? One might think this question is akin to the old chestnut of, is the Pope Catholic? And well, I guess it still is. You see, time was, everyone was sure the Pope was Catholic, and everyone was sure he was, in fact, the Pope. Nowadays, well, there's a lot of head-scratching about if the Pope is really Catholic, whatever that means. And there are some people who will say the Pope isn't the Pope. Here's the hard line on that. The Pope is the Pope. Any other position is just dumb. I'm not even going to dignify it with labels like heresy or schism or anything else. That gives the position too much weight, too much gravitas. But more importantly, the instant you start talking about church terms like that, you are in the weeds of an intellectual, philosophical argument with loads of complex terms and references and so forth. Not only am I, and probably you, and the vast majority of Catholics out there, not competent to have that discussion, I don't need it. It's actually counterproductive to dismissing it as dumb. The church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. It is one. It is unified, singular, monolithic. It is holy. It is the only means of salvation. It is Catholic. That is universal, the same church for all people. It is apostolic. It descends from the appointed followers of Christ, not just in a sense that the bishop knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew Peter, but that there is a formal chain of ordination and consecration going all the way back to Christ's laying on of hands. If the Pope isn't the Pope, all of that counts for nothing. If the Pope isn't the Pope, then he's just some dude in white. Maybe he's a priest in white or a bishop, but to some of the nope to the Pope crowd, they maintain he's not a priest either. Some of them say he's not Catholic because he's a heretic and he's excommunicated himself and therefore he can't be Catholic, so he certainly can't be Pope. There are loads of flavors of this, but they are all unified by a single thread, the man all but universally acknowledged by Catholics and Christians and other religions and atheists and governments and the media and entertainment and business and the man all but universally acknowledged by everyone as the Pope isn't the Pope. And so when someone comes along and wishes to profess the one true faith, the only means of salvation, the faith founded by Jesus Christ himself, where does he go? Well, he naturally chooses Catholicism because he is a man of taste, discretion, culture, and intelligence. And because the Pope is all but universally acknowledged to be the Pope. He petitions for and is received into communion with him. Ask yourself this. Does God want to make it difficult for people to be saved? Does he only want to save the intelligence, those with access to particular resources or periodicals or arguments? Or does he want to make it as easy and open as possible? He wants to make it easy. That's why the church is one and Catholic. That is universal. Would God create a situation where the visible church, the one which is the only option for so many people, is actually in communion with an apostate, thus denying so many people through no fault of their own, and no matter what they do, denying people any opportunity for salvation? If the Pope isn't the Pope, then God has abandoned his church. The gates of hell have prevailed. Christ has divorced his bride. That is why I dismiss it as dumb, not because the people who believe it are dumb. Many are intelligent, very educated, very learned, more intelligent than me, and probably more intelligent than you. But as I learned when my multiple PhD uncles stood there with a wet dish in one hand and a tea towel in the other and said, "What do I do?" very intelligent people can do dumb things. That is a true story. I dismiss the notion the Pope isn't the Pope as dumb because it can be dismissed without anything more complicated than a Baltimore Children's Catechism knowledge of the faith, the knowledge of the faith a medieval peasant who couldn't read or write might have had. In this instance, too much knowledge can be a dangerous thing because it short-circuits the childlike faith we should have, which tells us God will never abandon his church. We become caught up in our own brilliance, our own intellectual pride, and we fall because we reject communion with him who all communion needs to connect to if we wish to commune with God. And of course, let's discuss the elephant in the cloister here. This is the most first worldy problem of all first world problems. We wake up in our comfortable beds in our warm houses in secure cities and turn on machines which use pure water delivered by faucet and beans from a quarter world away to make coffee, and we flip open the glass rectangles we keep in our pockets which give us access to the sum total of human knowledge, and we go on Twitter and we argue about if the Pope is the Pope. Meanwhile, in the rest of Christendom, Catholics are being persecuted. Even closer to home, people are poorer, marginalized, struggling to make ends meet. We drive half an hour to Mass past 4 other Catholic churches because we prefer the homily and the liturgy, while they are lucky to see a priest twice a year or attend a Mass where they don't get blown up by Islamicists. This is not me saying, suck it up, Buttercup. Well, maybe a little. This isn't me dismissing your experience. This is me reminding you that most Catholics haven't ever heard the idea the Pope isn't the Pope. They're too busy with other things, even assuming the knowledge, the idea, the suggestion can get to them. If salvation depends on not being in communion with this putative apostate and being something else, do we know what? Is there consensus on what is if we are to say the Pope is not? If salvation depends on not being in communion with this putative apostate, then a majority of Catholics are damned because they've never even considered the Pope might not be the Pope. It's not on their radar, they've never been told it. And we're not just talking about some poor ignorant farmer in the wilds of wherever is still wild these days. Probably a whole bunch of regular Catholics in your pews have never heard or considered the idea because they just aren't that engaged. Is the Pope the Pope? Yes. Unfortunately. There are plenty of reasons to be unhappy with the Pope, to be angry with the Pope, to be disappointed in him, to think all kinds of things about him. His messaging is confusing at best, his governance is abysmal, his hypocrisy when it comes to appointments and discipline and even humility is awful. Some people have said he is the worst Pope in history. Now, given Alexander VI and the rest of the Borgia boys, that is a high bar. Or a low one, I guess, but I'm not going to argue it. He might be the worst Pope in history, but he's certainly Pope, unfortunately. You don't have to like him, you don't have to agree with him, you don't have to defend all his decisions, but we must acknowledge the reality that he is Pope, because if he's not, then the Church is not the Church. Just because a father is abusive, it doesn't mean he's not your dad. To say the Pope is not the Pope is a dangerous, schismatic act. It is one which leads people away from the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is the only means of salvation. It leads people into pride and disobedience and uncharity. And if the Pope is the Pope, well, then he's the Pope. He has the power and authority and privileges according to his office. He has, like it or not, agree with it or not, hate it or not. He has immediate and universal jurisdiction over a whole bunch of stuff, including the liturgy. We can complain, we can moan, we can cry, we can cajole, we can beg, we can do a whole bunch of stuff, but ultimately we have to accept it. When it comes to laicizations, his decision is final, and fighting it is like spitting into the wind. It's not just a question of accepting it. There is a formal reality which makes his decision real. We don't have to like it or agree with it, but we have to accept it. Prudentially, his decisions may be bad. They may be made for the wrong reasons. They may have negative effects, but the authority to make them is God-given. We cannot say the Pope is the Pope, but me no buts. The Pope is the Pope and he gets to be the Pope. Again, just because he's an abusive father doesn't stop him being dad. In a world of biological families, I would never say that. But here in the Church, maybe we're getting what we deserve. Is the Pope the Pope? Yes, unfortunately. All right, Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you're pointing out that was very, very important, and I was actually talking with my dad on the phone with the other night. We
go from bad fathers to good ones. I've met your dad. He's a great guy.
Yes, he's wonderful. We all love my dad. I think I did an episode of the Daily Beat on him one time, actually.
Good, excellent father.
Now, what we talked about was that a lot of this appears to be linked to this. Pope Leo XIII called this Americanism, this obsession over this democratized thing where everybody gets a voice, this rugged individualism, this idea that everybody deserves a say in something. This is why a lot of these Catholics even think it's okay to go out there and step in front of a webcam or step out on Twitter or go on social media, do any of those things and say the Pope isn't the Pope. He is the monarch of the Catholic faith. He is the monarch of the Church. He's the monarch of the Vatican City. We are a monarchy. We are a hierarchical system. He is the vicar of Christ on earth. He is the deputy to Jesus Christ. and you need to obey him.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up Americanism because, I mean, the vast majority of our audience, are, from here between the Rio Grande and the, 49th parallel between sea and shining sea. And so they are, American. And the notion that Americanism is a heresy, I think, firstly, a lot of people have never heard that. And then when they do hear it, they think, oh, wow, is this just like, some, European dude, tamping on
and it doesn't
Americanism.
mean being an American.
No, and it doesn't mean being, it's a very specific philosophical, theological error that is described there. And I think as well that even if you don't want to go to the formal level of an Americanism heresy, there is a sort of pernicious rebellion and independence within not just Americans. I mean, I think that it comes out greatly in America, but generally speaking, look, pernicious rebellion has been what humans have done since the Garden of Eden. And this idea of I'm going to speak, I'm going to make my statement known, I'm going to have my opinion known, and then say, well, it's just my opinion and this is a thing that should be said, is really quite a very human thing. So it's a very human desire to want to say the Pope isn't the Pope. And as well, as I kind of said, he's a really bad Pope. Pope Francis is a really bad Pope.
Yes, he is.
And he is in many ways an abusive father. He's an absent father, he's a confusing father, he's showing favoritism to certain children. All of these things that, those of us who have had fathers, which I think is most of us, and those of us who are fathers, or those of you who are fathers, would be familiar with that and like, oh man, I'm glad I'm not that kind of father. I don't want to be that kind of father. But that is the kind of father Pope Francis is. But don't stop him being dad.
No, it doesn't. I mean, and he has his power, and that's the thing. We kind of need to weather the storm. Like you said, like if you have an abusive father, he will always still be your father. It doesn't matter. That person will always be your father, and as a child, you have to be obedient to your father, or your father is going to discipline you.
Yeah.
And that's always basically been this accepted principle throughout human history, and specifically in the West, which has those, has those philosophical underpinnings that came from, Plato and Aristotle, even before the Catholic Church came over, and then were synthesized by Augustine and Aquinas throughout the medieval period. All of that comes together to basically say you need to be obedient to your father in all but sin.
Yes, and I think that's kind of what I was driving at there, that many of these things that Pope Francis is doing, for example, the suppression of the Latin Mass, obviously...
That's not sinful.
It's not sinful. Is it horrible? Is it awful? Is it something that's traumatizing a lot of people? Is it upsetting a lot of people?
I'm sad. You're sad. I'm sad too. We're all sad. We're sad, but you know what? Dad said so.
Dad said, and it may be a bad decision, and maybe another pope will undo it in the future. We hope, and these things will be changed. But again, I just want to return to kind of the central point that I made there, that the issue, the question of going around and saying, if the Pope isn't the Pope, then the vast majority of Catholics out there do not have access to, meaning they can't go to a Mass or get sacraments from, or engage with in any meaningful sense with the real church. If the Pope isn't the Pope, then the visible Catholic Church isn't real in some sense. And you can argue a lot of, sacramental theology and all this sort of stuff with it, but if the Pope isn't the Pope, and the people that you're going to for your sacraments are in communion with this impostor in white in Rome, if they're with the impostor Bergoglio, bit sauce, whatever the kids are saying these days, that you don't have access to the church. And that means the church isn't universal, the church isn't Catholic, the church has failed in its mission to bring holiness. All right, Joe, great to talk to you as always. And now we'll be shifting over from one sophisticated gentleman to another sophisticated gentleman. So we will be going to our gentleman's chat with our favorite tweed suit wearing Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomesh. Hello there, Jules. How are you doing, and what's happening in Rome?
Salve, Simon, as they say in Italy. I must say, I'm slightly more relaxed in Rome because Pope Francis is away on his African safari. And so at the moment, the Congolese are cheering for him, packed the stadium, and the reporters on board the papal aircraft and seated alongside him are reporting what the Vatican wants us to hear. But they won't tell us what the Vatican does not want us to hear. And of course, that's church militants' job.
Well, yes, of course, that's what we're all about. But obviously, yeah, as you say, the Pope is in Africa. He's not in Rome right now. So what is the mood in the Vatican different when the Pope isn't there? Do things kind of get done without the Pope noticing, or does everything just sort of carry on much as before?
Well, it's funny you ask that question, because I often tell people the people who run the Vatican couldn't run a lemonade stand successfully. And it's kind of almost engineered to be dysfunctional, so that at the end of the day, no department knows, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so everyone has to go running to Pope Francis, and then he can call the shots on everything. And we talked about this, his dialectic between pretending to decentralize, but then micromanaging everything. But in terms of his African safari, what the media is not telling you, that a day before he left, there was a press conference held in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it was in French and it was in English, a bilingual press conference, and this was about clerical sex abuse, including the abuse of nuns. And almost no mainstream media is reporting the story. A 14-year-old girl was raped by a priest. A couple of months ago, I reported on 50 young boys. This was homosexual rape by a missionary priest. Again, nothing was done. Everything was covered up. But the reporters with Pope Francis simply won't ask these hard questions, inasmuch as they won't ask him specific questions about his friend, the Jesuit artist, Father Marco Ivan Rupnik.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to get you on that plane, Jules, and I would try to get you on the plane, with Pope Francis, but I fear that, he might just sort of throw you out of the window or something like that. It'd be one of those. It just seems a great shame that obviously the Pope he goes and he gives these, I heard them described as ex-aeroplaner declarations, where he's on one of his planes and he makes some, statement that causes a great degree of controversy and consternation. But he will not address these grave concerns that we have. I mean, obviously very, very disturbing. So you spoke about, the Pope's African safari. How is the Pope being received in Africa? Obviously the faith is very strong in Africa, we hear, but how is the Pope being received there?
Oh, yeah. Before I answer that question, I do think he is capable of throwing me out of the aircraft, because don't forget, Pope Francis was a bouncer in Argentina at a club there. So that's part of his curriculum vitae. And he's continuing to practice it in some ways.
I just have this vision of Pope Francis kind of standing there. You and I, Jules, we're from the UK originally, so we've all been to the nightclubs, and of course there's this thing of the British nightclub bouncer, and he's this big, hard lad. And he's got tattoos, and he supports Millwall, and he's got the shaved head, and he's like, if your name's not on the list, you're not coming in. And I think that, actually, to be perfectly honest with you, I think if we had more of that from Pope Francis, like, if you're excommunicated, I'm not letting you back in, I mean, that might actually be better. But sorry, Jules, please continue about you being thrown off the airplane by our ex-bouncer Pope.
Apart from being thrown off the airplane, it's almost, I can go on board these jaunts with Pope Francis, because all journalists who are part of the Vatican Press Corps are free to go on board. We pay our own way, of course. But the problem is the whole thing is so carefully orchestrated and rigged that only a select few journalists get to ask questions, and the questions are vetted beforehand. So that there's really no point, and the whole press conference, ex-aeroplaner press conference is carefully staged. But how is he being, you talked about African Christianity thriving. Yes and no, because it is thriving, it's growing, but African Christianity, particularly African Catholicism, has very serious problems at the moment. And one of the problems is the massive. Sorry, am I imitating Donald World there? Massive problem in Africa is the almost systemic sexual abuse of nuns by priests. And I know this from personal testimony. I was teaching at a Catholic seminary many years ago, and one of the brothers put his hand up and he said, my sister is a missionary nun in Africa. And she said she couldn't get a certificate from her local parish priest. The parish priest said, if you don't sleep with me, I won't give you the certificate. So that's one aspect of the breakdown there. But secondly, there's also a massive breakdown of celibacy. And I've heard this from top sources that there are dioceses where Rome cannot find a single priest to elevate to the episcopate because all the priests have children. Now, of course, they get by saying that it's it's cultural, which of course it is. That you've got to reproduce.
I mean,
really,
one can argue for culturally for married priests. I mean, there have been cultures and times when that's been the case, but I think one cannot argue for culturally raping nuns. I mean, that seems a cultural bridge too far. That seems like the kind of culture we should be destroying and not appropriating or something like that. Wow, I had no idea of the depth of the problems within the African church, because of course all we hear about it is the African church is thriving and it's very faithful and it's wonderful and it's the future of the church. But my gosh, Jules, that's terrible.
Yes, and Simon, if I may very quickly say here, I'm investigating a story where bishops have broken away, consecrated their own bishops. We talk about the SSB, Archbishop Lefebvre on one side, but this is happening now in Africa, and thousands of Catholics have left and priests have left and because of celibacy, and they say, that's not right for our culture. We will remain Catholic. We will remain part of the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. We will use Catholic liturgy, but if Rome doesn't want us to be celibate, we just cannot handle that. So that's another aspect of the crisis in Africa that, again, the mainstream media simply won't talk about.
Yeah, it seems, I think, that we again, here in the West, in America, in Western Europe, in the Anglosphere, we obviously all have our own, concerns and problems, concerns about the liturgy, concerns about statements made about homosexuality, and obviously the great culture wars such as abortion and the cultural issues within the church and so forth. And again, contraception. Some ridiculous number of Catholics within the West are accepting contraception. But we need also to realize that these other places in the world, other parts of the church, are having their own difficulties and problems. So, Jules, when does Pope Francis get back to Rome? When is your pleasant time without the chaos over? When's he back?
Well, don't remind me. I think it's he's back on the 4th or something like that. My former Archbishop Justin Welby is joining him on a jaunt to South Sudan. And this is the other odd thing, because Pope Francis cannot go to a country that is hardly a square kilometer in its dimensions. But he's gone to pontificate to help. He and Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, have gone on a mission to help the war-torn Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan with their problems. Now, when I was a canon theologian at Liverpool Cathedral many years ago, actually not very long ago, one of the senior cleric, Anglican clergyman from the Congo had visited, and Justin Welby has been there earlier. And I took him to lunch and I said, so what do these guys actually do when they go? And he laughed and he said, these Westerners, they think they can come and help us out with our problems. Well, Welby comes, he has, a good time. We give him a good time. We humor him and he thinks he's doing a good job. He goes back and we laugh. We have a good laugh behind his back. So this is the virus of virus of wishful thinking that has infected, both the Church of England and the Vatican, and they think that everybody comes to the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope to resolve their problems, but actually most people don't give two pennies about what these guys say out there.
Yeah, I think, what it is, it's part of this whole Davos man kind of idea. It's these people who are living these very privileged lives, very isolated from the problems that they're seeking to solve, going in, imposing these problems. Obviously it's a term one doesn't like to use, but it almost sounds kind of like a colonial sort of solution to these problems, a real, high-handed, arrogant understanding of imposing these solutions. Well, hopefully things can improve within the African church, and hopefully a solution for the African problems can come out of Africa. Jules, once again, thank you so much. That's all we have time for this week, but I will see you next week. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Simon.
God bless, Jules.
God bless.
Always wonderful to talk to Jules there in Rome, in the Vatican, so close to all of these contentious issues. But remember, when asked the question, is the Pope the Pope? The answer is yes, unfortunately. I'm Simon Rafe, and I've taken the hard line.